Just going to let a few folks in here. Give it a couple seconds for those folks to join. Okay. I think we'll get started. So hi everyone, and welcome to this special talk by Dr. Meg Gibson on her research study, Neurodiversity Matters, Challenging Practices in Social Services and Education. So I know we have folks who are joining us from different institutions, or maybe you're going to be watching the pre-recorded version of this, but either way, we're really happy to have you here today. So I want to start this presentation with a land acknowledgement or a territorial acknowledgement. The University of Waterloo acknowledges that we live and work on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land granted in legally binding treaty to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles of each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, community building, and outreach, and is centralized within the work of our Truth and Reconciliation Working Group and the University of Waterloo's Indigenous Initiatives Office. So before I officially introduce Dr. Gibson, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of today. So again, like Dr. Gibson's going to give a little bit of talk on her research, and then there will be a little bit of opportunity at the end for some question and answers or things to think about and self-reflect on later if you're watching the pre-recording. So with that, I think I'm going to do my little introduction of Dr. Gibson, read her little bio. So Dr. Gibson is an assistant professor in social work and social development studies at Renison University College, affiliated with the University of Waterloo. She is the principal investigator of the Neurodiversity Matters project. Meg's research and teaching focuses on critical disability studies, queer and trans studies, social work, feminist research methods, and the history of social services. She is honored to be able to work with so many committed and insightful people who have brilliant ideas about neurodiversity. Meg believes that research can change how we understand each other and what we see as possible. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Margaret. And I really appreciate everyone who showed up on a Friday afternoon, which is quite lovely, at least where I am. So thanks for joining and wanting to talk about neurodiversity. Just going to take a moment to share my screen so I can get slides up here. And it is, can you all see that now?
We can, yes.
Yay. Okay, so what sharing my screen means is that I can't really see folks and I can't see the chat. So if there are urgent things that you want to communicate with me, I think you're just going to have to unmute and shout it out because I won't be able to see the chat. But in general, in this presentation, I hope that it's kind of more of a reflection and or conversation. And I wanted to just have a couple of comments about access to start with. So do we have closed captioning on for folks? That would be my first question. If we have that enabled, that would be awesome. I'll also try to do a bit of audio description of any images that I show. I may mess up on that, but I'll just start by describing myself. So I am a white woman with short gray hair and glasses, wearing a kind of red and black multicolored top. And as you listen to this presentation, feel free to move around, communicate, stim, do whatever feels comfortable and appropriate for you. Okay, so why are we talking about neurodiversity? So this is something that I feel really passionate about. And fortunately, there are also lots of other people who feel really passionate about it as well. So what I see as really great about neurodiversity is that it's thinking about things in a new way. So sorry, it's just not letting me move on until I acknowledge the transcript. And there we go. So I think of neurodiversity as asking us to reflect and asking us to maybe change. And as practitioners and educators, we're often thinking about change because, as we see in the world around us, change is a pretty constant demand, maybe the only constant out there. But when we're thinking about education and practice, what are the things that help us in determining the kinds of changes that we need? So if we're thinking about things like being inclusive and being just in our spaces and our practices, what are we going to use to help us? So the image with this slide is of a very large and dynamic wave. I'm going to say that research is one of the things that can help us in thinking about our practices and our programs and institutions. So sometimes people think of research as something that's kind of remote, maybe just up on a shelf somewhere or in an internet journal somewhere, and may even think of it as something that's just about defending or entrenching the status quo. But I would argue that if we start with different kinds of questions and we talk to different kinds of people, research is actually one of the best ways to shake things up. And neurodiversity research, I would also argue, can really help educators and practitioners to do things differently and to think about things differently. Many of us are already doing this, but sometimes we can use some help also convincing our colleagues. And there's an image of plants kind of overtaking bookshelves, which I thought was about fertile research. You may disagree. So I'm talking about a piece of research that I've been working on with a number of other people who I will acknowledge, and one of whom is here today. So Julia can do a little wave at the end. So the Neurodiversity Matters project is a research project that's funded through a SSHRC Insight Development Grant. We also received a Renison Internal Research Grant. And there's two big branches to this project. We have a discourse analysis branch where we have been doing a systematic review of what people have been writing about neurodiversity. And then we have an ethnography branch of the project, which is where we have been talking to actual humans about what they are doing and thinking when it comes to neurodiversity. So we did 60 interviews with folks who had thoughts to share. And again, lots of people have lots of thoughts on this. And we also did observations of some events, which all ended up being online events because of the pandemic. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the interviews part of the project, but I'm happy to take questions on the rest of the work afterwards. So what is this neurodiversity thing? So it's not new. Neurodiversity as a term has been around for over 20 years now. It's usually attributed to Judy Singer and Harvey Bloom, who both published things with this term in 1998. More recently, it got back into the New York Times bestseller list through Steve Silberman's 2016 book, Neurotribes. But the basic premise of it has actually mostly been worked out through autistic and other disability justice activists. So you see a lot of it on blogs and social media and in activist spaces. The basic premise or idea of neurodiversity is that people are different, right? We have all different ways of sensing and acting and responding and experiencing. And it's useful to acknowledge this as a difference rather than to start with a pathologizing lens. So most people who are neurodiversity activists or advocates really want us to step away from this idea of cure and intervention as like our best strategy. Really start moving away from this idea that some kinds of differences are okay and other kinds of differences are fundamentally bad. And instead see all of us as having different ways of being in the world. And often this involves our neurology or nervous system in some way. So neurodiversity doesn't negate the importance of support. It doesn't say that people don't experience disability. And also, it's not something everybody completely agrees on, which I will talk about when we're going through some of the findings. So in the images here, I have the cover of Judy Singer's book, Neurodiversity, The Birth of an Idea. Steve Silberman's book, Neurotribes, and the Atlantic article by Harvey Bloom from '98 on neurodiversity. So what does neurodiversity do? So rather than just seeing it as like a term in the world, it's actually calling for people to do things. Usually people who are advocating for neurodiversity want greater decision-making from people who identify in some way with neurodiversity. So often this is specifically connected to autistic activists, but much broader, as we'll talk about. There's also a fundamental critique of dominant beliefs and practices, especially around things like functioning labels. So this idea that some people are, quote, low functioning and other people are high functioning creates these really harmful boxes to put people in, and often both discounts the entire experiences of people labeled low functioning and their contributions, but also discounts the needs for support or accommodations from people designated high functioning. It also tends to critique normalizing interventions. A lot of these can be seen in critiques of applied behavioral analysis, ABA, and just anything that people seem to be doing more for the comfort of the people around them rather than the expressed goals and interests of the people who are receiving the so-called treatment, right? And we can certainly talk more about that. Neurodiversity advocates usually also want people to have their support needs met and to have the ability to set their own goals. So again, instead of having treatments that are all about like neurotypical goals, so looking like maybe the quote unquote typical student, how do we actually ask people what they want and figure out creative ways of doing it? This is very connected to social justice movements. It's obviously part of advocating for social change on multiple fronts and rooted in a disability justice framework. So in this image, you see books by some autistic scholars. So Are Your Go's Authoring Autism, an excellent read, and Steve Kapp's Autistic Community and the Neurodiversity Movement, which is an anthology. Both really great reads if you want to learn more about the movements behind neurodiversity. Okay, so I haven't even gotten into exactly who we talked to, but the first finding I would say that we can talk about is that you can't just restrict who cares about neurodiversity to like a single group, that there are people who care about neurodiversity who identify with it in a personal way. There are people who care about it as service providers, or people who care about it as family members. And when I wrote a grant proposal for this project, I wrote about those three groups as if they were separate groups of people. As it turns out, the people who spoke to the project and had thoughts to share about neurodiversity were often, or maybe mostly, in more than one of these groups. So sometimes these groups of service providers, family members, and neurodivergent people or neurodiversity identified people are talked about as if they're these completely separate categories and that they have nothing in common with each other. And there's a lot of tension for sure across these groups, but I think it's also important for us to remember that people are multiply situated and that happens a lot. Okay, so ways that people identified with neurodiversity. I left this really open in the project. We listed lots of possible ways that people might identify with neurodiversity, but we're also just really interested in the kinds of experiences that people wanted to talk about when it came to neurodiversity. So these are some of the identities on this slide that were listed as ways in which people identified with neurodiversity. And neurodivergent definitely came through as a term that people often use to describe themselves, but not everybody did that. So again, as with everything else, there is a diversity of responses. It is worth noting that 30 participants out of the 60 people we talked to identified as autistic. So there's definitely a lot of overlap with autistic community and autistic movements, but then also lots of people identified with other things as well. So I realize I don't have time to totally read out this whole list, but I can share slides afterwards as well. And I'm happy to take questions. All right, so service providers we talked to. We talked to lots of people who were educators in various ways, so classroom teachers and educational assistants and early childhood educators. We also talked to lots of people who are therapists or counselors, lots of students in social work and social service worker programs, people in other nonprofit sector work, child and youth workers, crisis support workers, one OT, one person in corrections, like, so a pretty diverse range of service providers. And again, there was, sometimes some overlap. So it was hard to say, is this person, more a current social work student or somebody who's also been doing a lot of crisis and support work in the past, right? Okay, also diversity in terms of the familial relationships that were talked about. I would say in our common cultural context, we often hear a lot about and from parents as sort of the main relationship that people take to their advocacy. But, we talked to a bunch of parents for sure, but also people who were partners of folks who were neurodivergent or neurodiversity identified, people who were children of neurodivergent or neurodiversity identified folks, siblings, and like cousins, and sometimes multiple family members as well. Okay, second finding that I can talk about for sure is that people come from lots of different contexts. So in this image, we have some pie charts of different ways that people were demographically located. So socioeconomic status, for example, was a pretty tricky one to sort through. Happy to talk about that after. But we really focused on, were people saying that they were struggling, like sometimes or often struggling to make ends meet in terms of shelter and food, or were they not? And even that was hard because there was a pretty substantial number of folks, especially among autistic and other neurodivergent folks, who said, I would be struggling, but I'm being supported by a partner or parents. Gender was another interesting one in this project. Again, we talked to a lot of service providers and parents, and you often hear mostly from cisgender women in that context. But I would say it was an interesting mix because we ended up having to actually put out additional calls to talk to men in this project, which is unusual in, say, autism research. But we heard from lots of folks who were non-binary and gender fluid and trans, and ended up talking to a number of cis men as well. But majority were cisgender women. Race, we ended up with a white dominant sample. So like 78% of our participants were white, and we did additional recruiting as well for BIPOC folks. And we did end up, hearing from people from a range of racial identities and ethnic identities. So I can definitely talk more about any of these things. But now I'm going to share some quotes on how people understood and used this language of neurodiversity, which was sort of the central question of this project. What are people doing? Why do they care about it? And I really like this quote, for example. This is a neurodiversity identified social worker saying that neurodiversity can be defined literally and technically. It's a term that describes how wildly people's sensory perceptions vary and how differently people's brains work. And then they move on later to saying, less technically, I think neurodiversity is just magical. It's so cool how complex the human brain is and how many different ways people are able to perceive and process information. So neurodiversity was stated as, okay, yes, people are different, but also, isn't that cool? Isn't that magical? Another neurodiversity identified educator and parent talked about neurodiversity to me means the idea that there's a range of ways to be, think, communicate, act, and understand. By trying to stick everyone in the same box, we intentionally other people who do not naturally fit in that box. So this individual talked about being able to kind of pass, quote unquote, pass very easily in classroom settings as neurotypical, but that wasn't available or desirable for everybody. So in this definition, you can see that neurodiversity is about differences, and that we should expect people to be different. But it's also about how power operates, especially in systems such as education, where we create boxes of like what typical or normal should look like, and then we other people who don't fit in that box. So I asked about hopes and fears related to neurodiversity, because it is something that people tended to have mostly positive thoughts about, but also some reservations in their interviews. So, for example, this neurodiversity identified service provider talked about neurodiversity as a newer term. And they were also talking about neurodivergence as well. So it could almost feel like a new term that doesn't have all that nasty baggage. So sometimes you use a new term and people say, hey, like, why are you using that word? And then you get to say, well, here's what it means and here's why it's important to rethink what we're doing. But they also had some reservations and said, I'm also a little worried because as an autistic myself, I have that urge to categorize things efficiently. And in a way, neurodivergence makes the term even more watered down. It has so many things under it that it becomes like, wait, what are we specifically talking about in terms of the issues that this person might have or how we can prepare for their needs? So sometimes the umbrella capacity of neurodiversity is like really seen as a strength. And I would say everybody talked about how that can be great. It's new, it's also expansive, but that sometimes there were worries that certain groups or certain needs would be lost if it became too universalized. Okay, finding 3 that I'm going to talk about here is that neurodiversity in these interviews was larger than individual identity. So people were talking about their identities and their family members' identities and their clients or service users' identities, but they were also talking about larger things. So often they started talking about neurodiversity as, a fact, often sort of talking about biodiversity and kind of connecting it to this idea that, well, we know that people are different. Like this is actually not a controversial or new statement. But then they also usually moved into a discussion that would be considered more political, about inclusion, about access and justice. And sometimes this discussion was really focused on autism, and sometimes it was much broader. So I would say that is one of the areas like where people were drawing boundaries is one of the areas that was less settled in this project. And people were kind of thinking it through in the interview, sort of saying, oh, I thought about this only in terms of ADHD and autism was a common boundary people put. But actually, now that I think about it, it also includes experiences of mental illness or mad identity. So this is definitely an area of contention. And sometimes people were saying absolutely one thing, and sometimes they were saying absolutely the opposite. Neurodivergent, again, did emerge as kind of the identity-based term and as more common than neurodiverse, right? Most people said, actually, I don't think an individual can be neurodiverse. They can be neurodivergent if we want to talk about how they're related to power, and neurotypical being kind of the opposite of neurodivergent in that framing, or the alternative to neurodivergent in that framing. So the other way that it wasn't an individual identity thing exclusively was that people were rethinking these things in community and often online. So online spaces and communities often get a really bad rap. But I would say for the people that I spoke with or the other folks in this project spoke with, online spaces were often the best spaces to learn about this and to find community that would operate in a different way. So for example, this person who is a neurodiversity identified student said, I'm definitely part of a group and community that uses the term neurodiversity in a lot of different ways. We're very open with the term. I've seen lots of research that is arguing between whether it's just for autism or whether it's for many different things. The communities that I'm in agree on the fact that it is whatever the individual wants it to be or needs it to be. It's just a way of us quickly telling somebody else that maybe the same things that work for you might not work for me. So that's one discussion of community as really producing what neurodiversity means and how it's used and what people do with it. Sometimes community was also a source of debate. So this is a neurodiversity identified social service worker student who talked about sometimes within the community, there are debates. They'll say, no, I'm mad. I'm not neurodivergent. Or people will say, no, mad people aren't neurodivergent, who themselves aren't mad. And I'll be like, okay, well, I'm neurodivergent and mad. Or people who are using it in a very limited way to mean autistic people, and they're, I guess we kind of call cousins like ADHD and stuff like that, and anxiety disorders, but rarely including the mental illnesses. So this person talked about seeing a move toward a more broad umbrella overall, closer to what I feel, but still seeing that this was actually a process and a debate rather than a settled agreement. And in terms of online resources, so this neurodiversity identified student talked about, soon after diagnosis, going online to do research and discovering neurodiversity that way. I went online and I started doing some research, and I got lucky in that I found some blogs by autistic people pretty quickly. So I was sort of able to get to a point where I thought, okay, neurodiversity, thinking, acting differently, doing things differently, that's okay. That's a normal part of the human experience. So they still talked about struggling with shame and isolation, but really found that online spaces were where they found an alternative. So people were almost universally saying, we're finding ways that we can accept ourselves through community and through online spaces, not usually through our encounters with the dominant culture or with service providers. Okay. Finding number 4 so far, and we're still analyzing interviews. So this is somewhat artificial listing of findings, but these are central things that we definitely can say at this point. Neurodiversity is really widely used in some spaces and almost completely absent from others. So some people are isolated and, I'll just get rid of that. And other people are really well connected in discussions of neurodiversity. So some people were actually offering to participate in the project because they thought, oh my goodness, I want to ask questions about neurodiversity. This is a very unusual thing in a research project. You don't usually put a call out for people to come and talk to you about a thing and then have people offer to participate so they can ask you questions about that very same thing. So this to me and the team really meant there's this hunger out there for people to learn about neurodiversity and have spaces to talk about it, but not everybody has access to those conversations and to that information. The people who were really connected to this term and really, felt like I have lots of people to talk about this with, were people who were already pretty activist and online savvy. So they tended to be in circles where people were having conversations about multiple forms of oppression, and they were involved in lots of social media and online, like Facebook groups on the topic. There was also quite a bit of overlap between queer and trans communities and other disability movements and these conversations, which is interesting. Yeah, we can talk more about that at the end if people want. But I would also say we definitely found that racism, sexism, and other interlocking oppressions can shape who is able to claim neurodiversity and find these sorts of community supports. So definitely people who were some of our BIPOC participants in particular, or people who said, oh, I moved to this country more recently, like often we're struggling to find spaces where people were talking about neurodiversity or where it was a conversation that they were able to be included in or feel a sense of, equity within. So that's definitely another thing to explore. For example, in this interview, this is a Black female participant who talks about being a Black female in the excerpt here, talking about neurodiversity as something that she was actually really struggling with, whether it applied to her or not, or whether she could claim it or not. So when I asked that question about feelings related to neurodiversity, she said, "It makes me feel weak. Like I would not want to tell someone I'm neurodiverse, even outside of the study, or people I don't trust, because I don't want to be deemed weak or deemed that I can't manage myself. Or you should watch yourself around this person because she identifies as this. I don't want people to have that perception of me, especially being a Black female, whatever. I also work in a field that is very white male know-it-all-ish. So definitely would not want people to think I am outside the norm with that." And then in the interview, it kind of went on to talk about, how this was actually something I heard from other people as well. And she said, yeah, there's already all these assumptions of what a Black female is. So I don't want to be lumped into that crazy or irrational or angry kind of, especially as I try to learn and grow and navigate this world. Yeah, and this is somebody who tentatively identified with neurodiversity, but also identified as a family member in talking to us with the project. Okay, and the final finding I'm going to emphasize here is sort of the big one, which is that systems and practices need to change. And that's why people were coming to talk to the project. And we had lots of volunteers to participate. So participants were talking about a lot of struggle and a lot of trauma that were being caused by dominant beliefs and practices. They talked about the impact of diagnostic criteria, the impact of systems, lack of access to diagnosis, the ways that stereotypes of what quote unquote autistic people look like, or what ADHD looks like, and how those are gendered and raced and classed. All of these things are imposing a lot of barriers and a lot of trauma in people's lives. I talked a lot about education, lots of stories from educators, but also from people talking about their own experiences in schools at all levels. Social services. So often these were folks who were working in social services, but they were talking about the ways in which social services simultaneously reinforced a lot of ableism and sort of neurotypical values and norms. People that were interested in participating in this project often were, again, multiply identified. So these were autistic service providers or service providers who had various learning disabilities, dyslexic identities, ADHD identities, MAD identities, all these sorts of things. And they were really talking about the pressures they felt within the field to not identify in those ways and not be public about that, even within organizations that were specifically designed to serve folks from the community that they also belong to. So to not talk about being autistic in autism service organizations, for example. Employment and other income supports were really seen as ableist domains for lots of folks that they were really trying to also do work on. So sometimes trying to do consulting and diversity strategizing with organizations. But lots of people were underemployed or unemployed who have amazing and valuable skills and knowledge, and often skills and knowledge that other people are looking for, but they're being pushed out of these settings. So I think that's a really important thing for us all to reflect on is, who do we assume should be doing work in these kinds of fields, and what kinds of expertise are we looking for and excluding? Okay, so in terms of different practices that people saw as needed, there was a lot of discussion, as I mentioned, about the problem with our current policies that really put all of the eggs into the ABA basket for autism services. So for example, In this interview, the interviewer asked, how does neurodiversity affect what you do as a family member? And also went on to ask about interactions with service providers. And the parent educator neurodiversity identified person said, service providers is a tricky one. We were on the wait list for such and such a program some years ago. When we finally got near the top, my wife and I went in and they went over the services they offered. This was my first introduction to what ABA looks like in practice. On the way out, we both said, yeah, there's no way in hell we're ever doing that. Thanks, but no thanks. So there's a scarcity of services that leads to really long wait lists, and I think everybody knows that. But the problem is also what people can access once they get through the wait list to even find out about it. People talked about teaching their service providers themselves about neurodiversity and about, less pathologizing approaches and more effective practices. So for example, this person said, when asked, have you heard about service providers using neurodiversity language? They said, not really, no. I do notice a trend of a service provider only using it because they end up having a neurodivergent client for the first time ever. Basically, this client would end up teaching them. My therapist is great, but even he didn't know about what neurodiversity was until I came along. He was able to connect it very quickly because he specializes in trauma, so he was able to connect some points together. So this, for me, as somebody who is an educator of service providers, this was something I was saying, oh, okay, we don't want people to go out into the field and have to wait for service users to teach them things, right? That's tells me about my own practice and what needs to be different there. More generally, people really wanted to see social change of all kinds. So for example, this neurodiversity identified service provider was saying, I feel generally that the public looks at autism as almost like a pitiable taboo thing to have. All of this insecurity about what starts it, it has to be, why are they like that? Where honestly, they need to relax and just realize we're everywhere. Whether they like it or not, we are everywhere. And then they sort of go on to talk about, we've always been here. It's always been a thing. It's just been so focused on this negative, and this taboo, and this pitiable thing. It's just so much more than that. It just needs to be broadened and normalized. Normalize it, I think, would be the key takeaway. That would be my 2 cents. So actually, very few people know exactly how many neurodivergent people they already work with and know, because there has been so much discrimination and lack of access to diagnoses and lack of access to neurodiverse identity. So more change is required at that cultural level. So I'm going to kind of wrap up here, and I had points for reflection and discussion around things like, what would it mean to build programs and institutions that incorporate neurodiversity in a central way? So we can think about things like, how and when do we require diagnoses? Are accommodations available but actually really stigmatized? We can also think about knowledge and practices. Do they reflect neurodiversity? So what theories and models are we using? What are we teaching? And do we also present the critiques and actually listen to people who maybe have a different perspective on these very dominant theories and models? Again, behaviorism being the biggest one that my participants in this project really, really wanted to challenge. Finally, how could our ideas of professionalism and expertise incorporate diverse ways of knowing and relating and acting, and see these as important resources? So we can think about things like, how and why do we do interviews? What do we evaluate in performance reviews? Do we think it's actually okay and good to have a staff of an organization that includes nobody from the communities that we're trying to serve? Is that something that we can re-examine just as a starting point? Then I'm going to just thank some people here. So thank you to people who funded the project. Thank you to the Neurodiversity Matters team. So I have some folks' names up here. We do have several co-investigators from the project, from Brandon University, University of Toronto, and Julia Grusenwood who is, I think, still in attendance from the University of Guelph. So thanks to everyone. And here is also the project website. And again, I can make slides available afterwards. And I am going to stop sharing now. Now I can see people, which is also exciting.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Dr. Gibson, for your talk and how this applies to a lot of the roles we're in education and like support roles and service delivery, and maybe even we have a personal connection to the work that you're looking at. I'm wondering, in the next few minutes, would you be open to kind of taking questions?
Oh, yes.
Those sorts of things. Okay, so I don't know if you want people to raise their hand or just speak out. I'll let you, I don't know.
We're a small group. I think probably people can speak out, but
sure.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be in a question format also. It can just be this is a thing I'm thinking of. Yeah.
There's something I'm thinking about. I can start off. So I'm curious in your participants, if ever like the pandemic came up as like a topic, and I don't know, maybe depending on when you were like connecting with them and gathering that information, maybe it wasn't even
for sure
thing that was highlighted, but I'm curious, like in terms of like you talked about like finding community, and often these are happening online anyways, and you talked about like service delivery. Like I'm just curious if there was any conversation about the pandemic and how that's been impacted.
Yeah, we noticed that too. Yeah. So half of the interviews almost were done before the pandemic. So the first 25 interviews were done all in person. And then the last 35 were all done online. So that was interesting, actually. I didn't have to do as much in terms of official changes to the project because we had always designed it so that people could do interviews online if they needed to as an accessibility issue. So that was handy. I didn't actually have to change my protocols officially. But in practice, it meant that people shifted. Nobody had done a Zoom interview before. In terms of how much people were affected by the pandemic, like obviously this is hugely variable. And I was not sure how much to kind of go into it with people. Some people brought it up quite extensively in talking about their experience. But more often people were sort of saying that things that they had asked for or needed as accommodations previously were suddenly available. And so there was a lot of like mixed feelings about that, because in many ways, disability community has definitely had like skills and ideas to draw on in the pandemic and during lockdown, because there have always been people who, for health reasons and accessibility reasons, haven't been able to travel in person to things, but suddenly everything that was officially unavailable before became much more available. This is also technology dependent though, right? So I was talking to people who were able to access Zoom or a phone, right? So there's a bit of a self-sorting thing happening there. But I can also mention that Julia and I, for example, are both involved with another project that has a whole series of zines that autistic people specifically made about living during COVID. So again, there's really interesting other research out there that focus more on that. Andrea has her hand up. Would you like to ask a question, Andrea?
I would. Thank you. Thanks, Meg. That is really interesting research. I appreciate hearing about it. I just have a thought, like it's not fully formulated, but when you talked about the language of neurodiversity and sort of who uses it and who doesn't, or who has access to it and who doesn't, I was thinking about like the importance of language to resistance, like the resistance of, resistance to being pathologized. And I just wondered if in speaking to the participants, they talked about other ways of resisting through language. I guess what I'm thinking about, if that language isn't accessible for some people, does that not necessarily foreclose, but does it limit one's ability to resist the pathology, being pathologized or stigmatized or categorized, all of that kind of stuff.
I mean, I think there are other languages available as well. So this project is framed in a very particular way with language. And one of the things we started talking about as a team was, what do we do with this issue of language that is perhaps itself excluding people, right? Like, what are we doing? So if the term neuro, for example, is in neurodiversity, then it's going to work better for groups who have been well served by biomedicine, right? Like, linguistically, it's kind of connected to a scientific worldview. So and in many ways, that's going to be inherently uncomfortable and exclusionary to, I would say, Indigenous folks, Black folks, other racialized folks, people from, largely colonized communities who've really been targeted in very violent ways by biomedicine. So yeah, we definitely have quotes where people are talking about the language itself as excluding, but that doesn't mean they don't have other language. It's just, I don't think they come talk to this project about it. So that was the other thing. We didn't want to start hypothesizing that people didn't have ways of organizing and expressing, but it might be more a general, like, anti-poverty or like anti-colonial or like, let's actually respond to people in a more holistic way, not just in terms of things that could be deemed neurology, right? So I don't feel like I can say that people were like lacking resistance options exactly, but it did mean that they were not feeling connected to this particular movement, and that was something that some of the definitely some of the BIPOC folks were specifically talking about. There are spaces where, like, discussions of neurodiversity are just really, really white centering and really, perpetuate other problematic things. So does that answer?
It does. And I could maybe have provided a bit more context to my thinking, because I was thinking about institutional change and the change in practices and policies, and how we might inadvertently, like, reproduce something as exclusive through our language. Like, so what language can we use? Can we move towards? I'm thinking about mobilizing students around this, and what language can we use that will be more inclusive, right? And not, recenter whiteness in our attempt to resist within the institution.
Oh, totally. Yeah, totally. Because again, this is an example of a movement that's attempting to be kind of an umbrella movement, but then there are people saying this umbrella is not covering me, which we've definitely seen in queer movements. Like, we've definitely seen it in, like, women's movements and other spaces as well. And I'd be interested what other people think in terms of language. I do think disability justice, for me, seems like the language that is doing this work best. But at the same time, there are lots of people who don't identify with disability. So yeah, but if other people have suggestions on this, I think it's a really important kind of overall question. And neurodiversity definitely works well for a bunch of people, and probably especially well for, like, university student folks. Like, they were the ones who were, like, really quite passionate about this, but with other kind of caveats. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is actually a neurodiversity student group started at X University, formerly known as Ryerson. Any other questions for thoughts to contribute? Yeah, okay. I mean, I feel like there's a lot, a lot to think about with this, right? In terms of what we teach and what we do, you know, and how we evaluate things. People can definitely get in touch with me. There are also a couple of people from the project here. So Julia's here, Bridget is here. They're both, so if you have questions for people in the project, they're tired of hearing from me. No, I won't volunteer you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for your chat and for all of you folks who were able to make it out today. And hopefully for all you folks who are watching post-event, the recording. We're very grateful you were able to chat today and for all you folks on the call. And yeah, I think that's all from us. If you want to get in touch with us, so I'm hoping to share this pre-recording once it's live and with everyone who is invited, but we can maybe share your contact information as well if folks want to reach.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks
bye,
everybody.
everyone.
Happy Friday.